We're going to jump right in with this first story here that everybody needs to pay attention to, because it's not just about Brazil. Okay, this is about censorship. This is about suppressing information, and it could happen to any country. It can happen to us here in the United States. And I think people need to see this. I'm going to start with this article here from The Guardian, and then we're going to go to Glenn Greenwald, because I want you to hear what he had to say, because he is directly affected by this because he lives in Brazil. So check this out, guys. That is Elon Musk there. He has been big topic of discussion recently. X, formerly known as Twitter, goes offline in Brazil after Elon Musk's refusal to comply with local laws. Woo! Listen to this, guys. One of the world's most popular social networks, X, has gone offline in Brazil, the country with the 5th largest digital population, after Elon Musk's refusal to comply with local laws meant it was blocked by the Supreme Court. Millions of Brazilian X users found themselves unable to access the network on Saturday morning as internet providers and mobile phone companies began to enforce the ban. Now, it was just, I want to say maybe late last year or very early this year. I believe it was late last year that I told you about the censorship in Brazil of the platform Rumble. So Brazil had decided not to feature Rumble in Brazil. Now, obviously, there is one particular journalist that is in Brazil and does have a Rumble platform, and that is Glenn Greenwald. So what happens when rules like this are enforced? And some of you may be wondering, well, how is Glenn Greenwald still doing his Rumble show? Because Glenn is using a VPN, and we'll get into that a little bit later. When The Guardian tried to access the network on its computer and mobile phone, it received a message reading, "Seems like you lost connectivity. We'll keep retrying." Large number of Brazilians sought shelter on the rival network Blue Sky, which reported that it had gained 500,000 users in the past 2 days. "Welcome to Blue Sky," the company posted to its new adherents in Portuguese. Blue Sky's new members include Felipe Neto, one of Brazil's top social media influencers with more than 17 million followers. Don't forget, when you go to another country, you're obliged to follow its legislation, even if you disagree with it. So that came from Nico there. The banning of X, which has more than 22 million users in Brazil, is the climax of politically charged month-long arm wrestle between the country's top court and the right-wing tech billionaire. Now, they are referring to Alexandre de Moraes here, the influential Supreme Court judge. He's responsible for the ban, had been spearheading an attempt to force X to purge anti-democratic far-right voices in the wake of January 2023 uprising in capital Brasilia, carried out by supporters of the former far-right president Bolsonaro. So here's a little bit here about Elon Musk, who has aligned himself with right-wing figures, including Bolsonaro and his U.S. ally Donald Trump, pushed back. And he's accusing Alexandre of squelching free speech and trying to censor conservative views. Musk's public attacks on Alexandre, many of them infantile and vulgar, were reminiscent of repeated online digs at the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer during the recent far-right UK riots, which X's owner was accused of inflaming. Now, obviously, again, the most popular, I think, investigative journalist that we all know that is in Brazil is Glenn Greenwald, who has a show on Rumble. He also heavily utilizes X, formerly known as Twitter. So, of course, he is directly impacted by this. I want you to hear from Glenn about how he's affected and how other people in Brazil are affected by this ban of X. And what does this mean for the future of free speech? And are we next? Let's get into this clip here.
Reuters today, quote, Brazil's top court threatens to suspend X by Thursday night. That's tonight. Quote, a Brazilian Supreme Court justice on Wednesday ordered billionaire Elon Musk to name a legal representative for his messaging platform in X in Brazil within 24 hours or face the site's suspension in the country. Early this month, X announced it would close its operations and fire its staff in Brazil due to what it called, quote, censorship orders from the judge, Alexandre de Moraes. X, at the time, claimed Moraes secretly threatened one of the country's legal representatives in Brazil with arrest if it did not comply with legal orders to take down some content from its platform. By the way, that was not a secret order. That threat was very explicit, that they would arrest executives of X in Brazil immediately if those censorship orders were not obeyed. Quote, in Wednesday's ruling, Moraes says that under the country's law regulating internet issues, companies that do not respect Brazilian legislation or the confidentiality of private information could have their activities temporarily suspended. I believe the deadline for this was 8 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock p.m. in Brazil, which is 7 o'clock Eastern here in the United States. So we'll check online to see whether or not this has already happened, but certainly the deadline has already elapsed, and a lot of people in Brazil are wondering how much longer will we have X available to us to conduct our public debates, to hear about news, to communicate, to organize. Here was the order from the STF, which is the, basically it's an acronym for the Supreme Court, the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil. There you see it's a summons, and it was posted on X, which is not even a legal order. But because there's no one in Brazil to accept this order, the STF, the Supreme Court of Brazil, just went on to X, and underneath the government affairs account of X, posted what they purported to be this legal order, a summons for Elon Musk and global affairs. It says Minister Alexandre de Moraes orders the Justice Secretary of the Federal Supreme Court to notify Elon Musk by electoral means of the decision given in the above-mentioned case on August 18th, which determined the summoning within 24 hours of the name and qualification of legal representatives of ex-Brazil and national territory, duly proven with JUCESP under penalty of immediate suspension of the activities of the social network X until the court orders are effectively complied with and daily fines are paid in accordance with Article 12, Section 3 of Brazilian law.
Now, let's pause here for just a second before he gets into a little bit more detail, because one thing I want to say is this. I am not a fan of Elon Musk. I find him to be quite annoying. I think he's just another rich billionaire who whines a lot, to be honest with you. That being said, does that mean that people should have their voices silenced from that platform? Absolutely not. I don't agree with a lot of the things that Elon Musk tweets on Twitter, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be able to use it. And I know some people hear this and they're like, oh, that's just Brazil. We don't have to worry about that. Well, I want you to think about what just happened to the CEO of Telegram. I want you to think about how the CEO of Rumble has also been affected. He fled France because he was like, I don't want to get arrested, just like Pavel in France, who was the CEO of Telegram. I want you to think about this. This is just the start. So it can start with Brazil and it can spread to other countries. I still was somewhat appalled that Rumble, that they were banning Rumble in Brazil of all things. I'm like, okay, the biggest platform is YouTube, right? That's the biggest, the video content platform out there that allows it's the second largest search engine. Google's the first. But they were going after Rumble. It was really weird, right? So I may not agree with conservative views, but that doesn't mean that the speech should be suppressed. And now we see what's happening. Now it's X, which is a huge, huge platform. I mean, there's millions and millions of people on X. And now it's just like, now X isn't allowed. So what's next? And which country is next?
In theory, let's just make this concession. If a foreign country or foreign corporation rather wants to operate in a certain country, it is true that in general, they have to comply with the laws of that country. And if they don't, they can be subject to punishment for violating the law like anybody else. The problem is when you have governments that are tyrannical and authoritarian and unjust and ordering political censorship, it's expected, especially for Western companies, that they're not going to comply with authoritarian regimes and shut down all opposition that's considered immoral. The Chinese demanded that of Google for a long time. Google became unavailable in China as a result. All the authoritarian countries that were taught to hate have had constant conflict with big tech over its refusal to censor dissidents or opponents of the government. And now this is contaminating the Western world as well. That's the context for all of this. It isn't as though there's somebody here convicted of pedophilia or child pornography who the Brazilian government is ordering X to ban or to take down and X is refusing. These are elected members of Congress, people democratically elected by the Brazilian people who have never been charged with crimes, let alone convicted of crimes. But this judge is simply saying, ban them, banish them from online, much as was done, let us recall, in the United States in January of 2021 to the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump. Although in that case, that was a decision undertaken by the platforms themselves, the pre-Elon Musk Twitter era, as well as Facebook and Google. Nobody ordered them to do it. There was no government requiring it. That was a decision they made on their own, which in many ways you could argue is worse.
And I want to say this as well to that point about X and banning other people as well. I don't agree with platforms deplatforming people either, but I have no control over it. And we all know these platforms do this, but I 100% disagree with it. That being said, I swear to God, it's like 100 times worse when it's the government doing it. And that's one of the things that we did learn from the Twitter files. I'm still waiting to see the Facebook files. I would also like to see some YouTube files. I would like to see files for those platforms as well. But now you have in Brazil, you have the government banning platforms. There have been a number of times where we've had politicians here in the United States also wanting to put restrictions on certain platforms. Weren't they just trying to ban TikTok just a couple of months ago after October 7th? They wanted to get rid of it because they felt like, oh no, the younger kids are finding out too much information about the creation of Israel, and we don't want that information to get out. So what happened? The ADL jumped in and started putting pressure on the Israeli lobby. The Israeli lobby started to put pressure on the politicians, particularly those that are in the back pocket of the Israeli lobby that have AIPAC as a donor. They started to put pressure on those politicians. You need to bring this bill to the floor so that you can ban TikTok. But you can't use the reason of, oh, they're finding out too much information about Israel and we don't want people to know. You have to use this excuse of China is going to try to steal our data and our information. So that's why we need to get rid of it. So I know some people back then, they just said, oh, whatever. I don't use TikTok anyway. It's just a bunch of people dancing on there. That's for younger people. I really don't care. But what I was trying to explain to people is that it's only a matter of time before they come after other platforms as well. And it may happen to a platform that you do use and that you do care about. So if this continues in Brazil, there's no telling this could happen in other countries as well. And also, where the hell is Lula? Where is Lula on this issue? Because I mean, like, as much we've given him quite a bit of praise for standing up to the state of Israel, to push him back on Western imperialism, but he does not seem to be too good on this particular issue, on the censorship issue, on deplatforming, censoring information. So where is Lula? Something to think about.
Because it shows the power of big tech, but in this case, it's the government demanding it. Here is from a Brazilian newspaper today called Metropolis that is very close to Alexandre de Moraes, that is reporting on exactly what he's thinking. Quote, Moraes has already decided to ban X. He's already decided to ban X, but is still evaluating how to do it. Quote, STF Minister Alexandre de Moraes has already decided that he will vote to overthrow X in Brazil, given Elon Musk's likely failure to comply with the Supreme Court's orders. However, Moraes is still evaluating how he will formalize his decision. At the moment, Moraes is analyzing 4 different scenarios and should only make his decision official this Friday, August 30th, or during the weekend. So maybe Brazilians have a day or two left to use X while they figure out the best technical means for banning the entire social media platform from this entire large country. The first possibility is that Moraes makes a unilateral decision, does not submit it to the entire court, It is then considered the most remote option. The second would be to decide unilaterally, but take the decision to the entire court immediately so that it can be corroborated by other ministers, whether in person or virtually. Moraes already has the signal that the majority of the Supreme Court will follow him and vote for the ban of X. The other scenario is that before deciding unilaterally, Moraes takes the case to the full court to be judged in person. If that happens, the case will probably only be discussed next week. And the fourth scenario would be for Moraes to take the issue to a virtual full trial tomorrow over the weekend. This is the hypothesis considered most likely, according to ministers interviewed by journalist Guilherme Amado. One day I'll tell you about this journalist. But he is very close to Alexandre Moraes, often serves as his messenger in the media. And that is probably an accurate summary of what Alexandre de Moraes is planning. Not whether to ban X from Brazil, just figuring out the best way to do it.
Yep.
Here is from Globo, the Global magazine as well. And this is actually quite unbelievable.
Before we get to this about the Global magazine, I want to explain to people, because when I first heard this news, I saw it on Twitter from Glenn Greenwald about Brazil banning X. And I'm still seeing people tweet on. And so I reached out to Nico House, who's also in Brazil. And I'm like, what the F is this? And he's like, yeah, I know, they're trying to push back on it. So in reality, here is what will happen. Obviously, people like Glenn and Nico, yeah, I mean, they're American, but they're still in Brazil. So because they live in Brazil, they have to follow the rules and the laws of that country. Now, how do you get around this? They can get around it by using a VPN. Here's the problem. A lot of people in Brazil, especially considering you're talking about a large segment of the population that is lower income or is poor, they can't afford to have a VPN. So if you can't afford the VPN, you're just not going to have access to X, to Twitter at all. So first it was Rumble, and now it's Twitter. Does everybody see what's happening here? So I don't know, guys. I warned people about this.
We have there the headline in Portuguese, so I'll just translate that for you, which is, as a result of a lack of representation in Brazil, the Supreme Court has blocked the financial resources of Starlink, a completely separate company in which Elon Musk is involved. There's no ruling that Starlink has done anything wrong. In fact, Starlink provides free internet to many of the poorest areas in Brazil. In 2022, Elon Musk was awarded all kinds of official commendations from Brazilian authorities for his benevolent act of providing free internet connection to many of the poorest areas in Brazil that the government hasn't been able to provide on their own. And yet somehow this judge, even though there's no finding that Starlink itself did anything wrong, has blocked the bank accounts of Starlink in Brazil in order to punish X. The article says, quote, this is from Globo, after X failed to submit legal representatives, FTF Minister Alexandre de Moraes blocked the financial accounts of Starlink Holding. Last week, Moraes claimed the existence of a, quote, de facto economic group under Musk's command, and on August 18th, ordered to block all of their Brazilian financial assets in order to guarantee payment of fines applied by Brazilian courts against X. Another of Elon Musk's company in the country besides X is Starlink, which operates in Brazil, selling satellite internet services mainly in the North region. All Starlink staff in Brazil has already been notified in order to respond for amounts to Brazilian courts owed to Brazilian courts by X.
Yep.
And then we have the Brazilian text here. Last week, Moraes considered the existence of a, quote, this was what I just read you that had already been translated. So I want you to see how extreme this is, because it is genuinely remarkable the lengths to which not just Brazil, but countries throughout the democratic world are now willing to go to prevent the internet from being a free exchange of ideas where human beings can organize freely and privately.
Yep.
Because they recognize that is the one threat to establishment power and to status quo ruling class prerogatives. I've been talking about this for a long time. Until 2015, the internet was basically free. And there was obviously a lot of surveillance going on. But this form of brute censorship was not common at all. 2016 was the turning point. That was when European and American elites concluded they couldn't control people's thoughts, as evidenced by, first, the British decision to withdraw from the EU by ratifying Brexit, and then even more traumatically, from the perspective of Western liberal elites, the decision to vote for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton and make Donald Trump president of the United States. And when they saw that, they decided that our media outlets that used to control how people think, the information they get, the kinds of opinions to which they're exposed, are no longer the gatekeepers. They lost their monopoly to the internet, to social media. And the only
That's right. And think back to it, guys. Politics has a lot to do with this, because think back to Obama '08. So at that point in time, during Obama's presidency, there was Facebook, right? So I think maybe not as many people were on Facebook right away, but there was Facebook that was around. There was also MySpace. But I think the difference was back then, at least when we talk about the political narrative, I didn't see a lot of exposure of, this politician exposed, of politicians as we do today. And I think the big political space, when we look at these platforms, does tend to be Twitter for the most part. I mean, how many of you go to Twitter and you'll find news on Twitter before you even see it on the TV, right? So that does tend to be the platform for political news and political information. But I think even back then, the vast majority of the American public was still being fed a narrative that fit the status quo and made the status quo happy. That changed come 2015, 2016, because all of a sudden the status quo did not get their way. Hillary Clinton, and you look back on it, they never predicted that Donald Trump would win in 2016. It was just always like, even Fox News was making fun of him when he was running. Now, once he won, that was a different story, but they were making fun of him. That was never really supposed to happen, right? Like, Hillary was supposed to be a shoo-in. And then there was an enormous amount, I remember during that time, particularly online, of negative comments and opinions about Hillary Clinton. There was information that was released that, again, I don't think the Democratic Party expected to get out to the public. But again, those things were all done online on those platforms. And then Hillary lost. And I think what has happened since then is, I do feel like a handful of billionaires that have invested money in those types of elections and those politicians, and also corporate media, decided, you know what, maybe we need to try better to control the narrative online. Maybe we need to try better to control the narrative on Twitter. How did this happen? This was not supposed to happen. And we've been seeing them crack down more and more, since then.
Only option we have for remaining in power to continue to be able to propagandize people and keep them in a closed information system is if we start implementing systems and justifying rationale for controlling the internet every bit as rigidly as we control large standard corporate media outlets, where most views don't get into those outlets ever. Most dissidents are never heard from. And since then, this has been a progression that is now manifesting in, I wouldn't call it yet its final form, unfortunately, but a much graver one than we've seen before.
Yeah.
There's an article in the...
We're just going to go ahead and stop it there, but follow Glenn Greenwald on Twitter, because he is giving us regular updates about this situation. Well, follow him on Twitter as long as you can, as long as he has that VPN, because he's giving us updates about the situation on Twitter. But I told you guys that this was coming. And I don't care what your political view, the political view that you have. I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, socialist, Marxist, whatever. I don't care. Nobody should be removed from these platforms. No government should shut down platforms, whether you agree with what's being said on those platforms or not. That is very scary. That is very authoritarian. And it makes me nervous. It makes me nervous for the future. Not just necessarily because of the show, but because it limits our ability to get our message out. And that is very concerning for me. So if you're not following Glenn Greenwald on Twitter, make sure you do follow him, because he's giving us updates about this in Brazil. Again, where is Lula?